I want to bring to you this afternoon something that I hope will be a very intriguing economic indicator. But like some indicators, for you to understand it, I have to explain what it's all about. Let me start with a simple economics lesson that I think we all know, but we might forget from time to time. A democratic form of government like ours, a capitalist form of government, depends on three sectors of the economy to operate efficiently and effectively. Now, I think most of us in here understand the private sector pretty well. That is the sector of wealth. The private sector's job is to build wealth. It's to provide opportunities. That's where our jobs come from. That's where opportunities to create large and long-term changes in our scope of economy come from. The public sector, the government sector, is responsible for infrastructure, and the Constitution is pretty clear about its responsibility for the safety and security of citizens. But there's a third sector of the economy that we don't talk about very often. In fact, those of us who do talk about it sometimes misunderstand how it operates. Economists call it the independent sector. It's the sector that actually takes care of or looks over the most innovative things that we do in society. It has the responsibility for quality of life. Most of healthcare is in this sector, education, arts and culture, human services, all of the faith-based communities are part of this sector. And many of us refer to what we know about this sector as nonprofits or NGOs. We say that all the time, talking about this nonprofit or that nonprofit. What you may not know is that the Florida Chamber is part of the independent sector. The Florida Chamber Foundation is part of the independent sector. In each community around the state of Florida, some of the key economic drivers, especially as they relate to things like biotech or high-scale, long-term intellectual property developing strategies, are part of the independent sector. The independent sector's role since the beginning of society in the U.S. has been to be the sector that is innovative and not driven by money. Now, that doesn't mean money isn't important, it just means it's not driven by money. We don't do much in the private sector that isn't profitable. It would be a silly endeavor, doesn't work very well, it certainly doesn't end up building wealth, and at the end what we end up doing is wasting resources if we fail in the private sector. In the public sector, we're driven by tax dollars, which is the will of the people and those who vote. And so since capital starts both of those sectors, no great company emerges, no great job happens, no great thing happens in the private sector without capital. In the public sector, nothing happens without taxpayers or some way to create revenues to fund it. But in the independent sector, when we need something done that we can't figure out how to pay for, we almost always delegate it to that sector. If we need places for hungry people to get something to eat, if we need places for homeless people to sleep, if we need to create some kind of great arts epicenter in a community, we turn to that sector to do it. We've also turned to that sector to develop things like airline travel. Many of the drugs we take for chronic illnesses were first developed in the independent sector and then, when profitable, handed to the private sector so a profit could be made. And so I tell you all of this because the independent sector's role and importance in the economy is so critical yet so silent in most communities around Florida that we forget. We sometimes forget where the capital comes from. It actually comes from the other two sectors. A lot of capital from the public sector, who turns to the independent sector to be more innovative and efficient and to drive things at a lower cost. The private sector funds the independent sector to take care of or find innovative solutions to problems. But you may not know that the independent sector funds itself as we all as citizens make contributions, donations, and investments. So just as in the private sector we have angel funders and we have venture funders, in the independent sector we have donors who give small amounts of money when they're asked to support things in their community, they volunteer, and we have philanthropists. And philanthropists are the investors in the independent sector. They're the people that create long-term charitable capital. And so as I look around the state, one of the things I find interesting, I think started in Central Florida, but I see it now coming out in South Florida, and I was in a discussion in North Florida recently where the same thing is happening. As chambers and partnerships and others representing the business community start thinking about priorities for what comes next, capital is first on their list. We need more angel capital, we need more venture capital, and now, yes, I hear them saying we need more charitable capital. And so the one thing that I would share with you from this shy economics lesson here is that the process of these three sectors has begun to blur substantially in the last several years. In most cases for the positive, in some cases for the not so positive. The reality is that none of these sectors own their space. The private sector does amazing things in wealth creation, but it sometimes can't get it done without economic development initiatives that happen in either the public sector or the independent sector. The private sector needs environments and communities that are strong and vibrant in order to create strong, vibrant businesses. It's difficult to build a business if you can't get people to move to your community and take jobs there because the quality of life doesn't represent where they want to live. The public sector needs the independent sector because as taxpayers begin to question the efficiency of the dollars given to the public sector still has a constitutional responsibility to do things that it literally can't afford to do. It's the independent sector that has to find substantially innovative and lower cost ways to get it done. And you might note that most of the money that flows from the public sector to the independent sector to create these services and outcomes has to be matched by private dollars, or has to be found in a way that generates revenues of its own. And so over time, what we know is that as these three sectors blur, as we know that all problems or issues or opportunities that we identify when we have community discussions belong to all three sectors, not just one of them, we've stopped delegating. We don't now say a job is a job only if it's a job in the private sector. We don't say that people in need or issues that we can't figure out how to make profitable businesses out of should only be in the independent sector. We now say to each other, how do we combine our resources and thought knowledge to solve these problems? And so you may have noted that Florida is now recognized as a hotbed of new kinds of businesses. In the old days, the very, very esoteric and innovative kinds of businesses that came out of the independent sector either stayed there or they converted to private sector businesses. And many private sector businesses that had very strong social measures connected to their balance sheets had to toil away in a sector that wasn't very forgiving for their lack of ability to raise capital. Today, Florida is home to dozens of hybrid companies who have a foot on both sides. One part of the company may be nonprofit or independent sector, providing direct services or charitable output or education, where on the other side, some kind of revenue-driven profit potential drives the economic engine that makes it work. Now, the reason I share all this with you is because when we look at economic indicators, it's usually a process of transaction economic indicators. We want to know how many jobs there are. We want to know what retail sales look like. We want to get an understanding of how many people are visiting here and how much money they're spending. And Florida, for so long, has been a state that thought of itself, sometimes privately, sometimes very publicly, as a transient state. We say it to ourselves in private conversations. We're not sure how many people stay here. We're not sure how long they'll be here. Well, I have an economic indicator for you today that would indicate that not only does Florida have roots, not only does Florida have people and legacy in its history that will drive the future economies of all three sectors, but Florida is now more than ever a place where people want to put roots and stay and have their family stay. The economic indicator I'm talking about is one that you may never have heard of and may not actually think about. It's called a transfer of wealth economic indicator. Now, back in 1999, Boston College did the first of these indicators. They did it for the entire United States. What they were interested in is how much money naturally transfers through legacy from the top generations in our society to the bottom generations in our society. Now, careful here, there's no transaction. This isn't about money available to do things or money being spent on things. This is matriarchs and patriarchs divesting their private businesses or taking their common wealth and transferring it to the youngsters in their family to go on and accomplish something in the next generation. Now, if this seems a little esoteric to you, you might find it interesting to know that since 1999, there have been a number of studies done that indicate some things that might shock you, one of which an awful lot of private sector business startup activity comes out of transfer of wealth. In fact, an awful lot of angel capital comes out of transfer of wealth. So when you wonder what happens to money as it transfers from one generation to the other, you have to have some kind of indication about what families think and where they are. And so it shouldn't surprise you that in Florida, when wealth transfers from one generation to the other, it could actually leave the state. Because if you came here to earn wealth but have no engagement or connection to the community that you live in, you would have no reason to leave your wealth here, especially if your children aren't here. Now here's the good news. The Florida Philanthropic Network, which, by the way, is an association of philanthropic foundations in the state of Florida, more than 100 of them, this is their statewide association. It's where they come together as corporate foundations, private foundations, and community and public foundations, they come together to actually look at the issues for investment in the independent sector. This isn't about giving. When you write a check to the Boys and Girls Club or the YMCA, you're giving. That's a good thing. That's what drives a democracy. We're all citizens. We give when we have it and people need it. That's giving. But at the higher level, just as it is in your business, there's economic investment in things that matter, and that's the role of foundations in most cases. So as the three sectors come together and blend, the foundations, the investors in the independent sector spend time with the public sector and the private sector to find out what things we're all working on that matter. And I think you know what some of those are. Certainly education is one of those things that matters to all of us. Certainly the quality of life in terms of who has jobs, who gets fed, and who has a place to live, that's of interest to all of us. Workforce development, oddly enough, is important to all of us. The Florida Philanthropic Network did something that's never been done in the state of Florida before. They conducted the state of Florida's first ever transfer of wealth study. Now, here's how you do this. It's not an easy thing to do because this isn't a survey. It's not calling everyone up and saying, hey, how much money do you have? And do you think you'll be giving any of that to your children? Because most of us would answer, I don't really have much, and what I have, I'm certainly not giving to my children, right? At the end of the day, it turns out that the primary motivation for developing wealth is to create legacy. That's what we do with it, even if we don't think about that when we're doing it. We build a great business. When the time comes for us to transfer that forward to our family, if we can't transfer the business, we're going to transfer the wealth. And you should understand that wealth is not something that rich people have alone. So if you look across the state of Florida, one of the things we learned from this study that's kind of interesting is that the average transfer of wealth over the next 10 years will be somewhere in the neighborhood of $43,000 a household. Now, most of you might say, that doesn't sound like wealth to me. But if you start with nothing and at the end of your life you have $43,000, you've created wealth. If you start with nothing and at the end of your life you have $43 million, we all say, oh, I get it, you have wealth. The reality is that the common wealth in a state reflects its ability to actually turn negatives into positives. It reflects the state's ability to actually move forward. So here's an economic indicator with some good news for you. In the state of Florida, in the next 10 years, we will transfer about $1.4 trillion in wealth from the top 2 generations to the bottom 2 generations. Now, if that sounds like a lot of money to you, you have to go around and add up $43,000 a household, because some of that is millions of dollars from high net worth people. Some of it is just what you and I have at the end of our lives when we sell our belongings and give it to our kids in hopes they'll do something good with it. And part of what they'll do with it is start businesses. And here's the most important thing. It creates philanthropic investment capital. Because when I transfer that wealth to my children, the first issue I have is a tax issue, and since most of us don't want to pay more taxes to the federal government to transfer wealth we've already earned, we tend to think in terms of the legacy we can create by putting that capital to work somewhere that matters. Healthcare, education, arts and culture, social services, maybe in the faith-based environments that we all worship in. So at the end of the day, this transfer of wealth is a driver of economies. It creates things that we can't see. And I'll say this to you, this transfer of wealth is driven by something called strategy. Now, strategy is what we do as nature in the private sector. Nobody gets involved in any investment that isn't strategic. In the independent sector, strategic means, yes, the same things it means in the private sector. Does the investment create a return? Does the investment create a strategic move forward? Does it solve a problem? Does it change something? Does it create an outcome that we can all recognize and measure and feel good about? And so at the end of the day, if your thought of the independent sector and nonprofits that reside in it is that people give them money and they do important things that you can't figure out, you might want to rethink that, because this transfer of wealth indicates that we're likely going to have a huge amount of new capital to strategically invest. Let me work through the abacus with you. If $1.4 trillion transfers in the next 10 years, and on average, let's say 5% of that goes to philanthropy, and by the way, would be a minority share, because the reality is that some people in Florida have already signed a pledge to give a majority of their wealth to charity or to philanthropy at some level. But let's say 5% goes. That's about $330 billion or so. If we endowed all 330 billion of those dollars, each year we would have about $17 billion available that would be usable in philanthropy. It'd be investment capital that didn't exist before. And so at the end of the day, one of the things that's important about transfer of wealth is that if you're wondering where the next generation of business owners are and where the next generation of philanthropists are, those people that will bring capital to the table for things like education and economic development and to help build strong communities, it may likely be coming right out of our pockets in a way we hadn't thought about. Because that transfer of wealth is tax advantaged. It's not like writing a check. If you make a contribution or an investment out of that transfer of wealth into something that has tax-exempt status, the foundation here at the Chamber, for instance, any of the foundations around the state, if you start your own foundation with it, then you have now created charitable capital that will be available forever. And that charitable capital doesn't replace public sector capital, and it doesn't replace private sector capital. It's capital available to change the quality of life across Florida. I want you to think about it this way just for a minute. If the transfer of wealth happens as we see, which means it's happening right now, we've never known this before. Imagine if there was a huge amount of venture capital activity going on in the state and we just didn't know it because the Chamber Foundation hadn't done any research. And one day we said, oh my God, there's billions of dollars in capital flowing to businesses and we didn't know it. Well, I'm here to tell you there's billions of dollars flowing from one generation of families to the next generation, and those that are able, capable, and willing to leave some of it in the state of Florida for things they care about, whether those things be charitable or not, that's capital that tells us that this state as a community is getting longer and stronger, and we have deeper roots than we've ever had in the history of the state of Florida. Now, if we don't pay attention to this, and we're not engaging people who are building wealth in our communities, if they're here to build wealth and they're not involved in civic activities, in the charitable sector, if they're not involved at some level in the things that are important to the planning of the community that you're here from, then that money will likely become pure private sector money that's generated, transferred, and leaves. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to say to the people who live in Florida, when we earn wealth here, whether it's $43,000 or $4 billion, there's a place that we can make an investment tax advantage to change the world. And that place is right here at home, in the very things that those investors care about, that we all care about because they're part of what builds the communities we live in. So I would say to you, if you want more information about this study is available and can be made available to you, and your access to it is in every community in Florida through your local community foundation. That's a public foundation that represents every place someone lives in the state of Florida. There's a community foundation. And they have the information and the ability to help you understand the demographics and psychographics of how this works. The last thing I would tell you about the study that I think you'll find interesting when you see it is this. Where does wealth come from? You might know that for years we've sat in meetings, all of us in this room have sat in meetings where people talked about what the future wealth in Florida would look like and where it would come from. Let me tell you 3 areas that might surprise you. 1, entrepreneurial growth. We see 7 of the 67 counties as having substantial wealth creation and growth over the next 30 years out of entrepreneurial growth. That is very simply the psychographic of people starting businesses and growing them and then transferring them or keeping them alive forever. The second is an area of what I would call creativity. Several of the counties, almost 18 counties in the state of Florida, have a significant wealth creation stat in the effort of creating something creative that has a profit center to it. So all the creative people you know that have a brilliant idea but they can't figure out a way to make it profitable, it's starting to work. And we're starting to see more creative business generation across the state than we've ever seen before. And the third place we see is in what's called social enterprises. So those of you who are already into this or know it, keep your eyes open because there are new businesses growing, scaling out of the state of Florida, which are doing something good, making a profit, and either helping the environment or employing people. That's called a triple bottom line. When you can do all 3, you've hit a dramatic home run. The capital for many of these businesses, for all of your arts endeavors, for all of the faith-based community, and for everything else strategic we see in communities we live in, comes every day out of donations and investments from higher level independent sector investors. But the big capital is passing by the window while we're sitting here as people in the state of Florida convert their wealth and determine what their next part in life will look like, and then create the legacies that fulfill what they did to get that wealth here in the state of Florida. On behalf of all of us at the Community Foundation of Central Florida and those of us at the Florida Philanthropic Network, let me just say thank you for all you do in communities across the state of Florida and for being here to be a part of this today.